Bruce, welcome to the Floor Plan. It's been a little while since we spoke, since you had me on your podcast.
Yeah, that's it. I'm delighted to catch up. It's probably been 18 months since we chatted.
Definitely. And we've talked about your podcast in the introduction, but you've had a really interesting journey. You've had senior leadership roles at YouTube and formerly Twitter. And now you're doing, I think very, very interesting commentary on work and culture. Was there a moment in your tech career when you thought, something's broken here about the way we work and I need to look at this differently?
Yeah, a couple of things happened. I used to work at Twitter, like you say, sort of predating that guy. And there was an interesting challenge that we had I was obsessed with workplace culture. We were smaller than our competitors. We were less advantaged resource-wise. And so I always thought, wow, everyone seems so much more motivated here than they had been when I'd been at a previous tech company. So I was like, well, maybe we can achieve more because everyone's just loving their job so much more. And we reached this interesting situation where a few years into my time at Twitter, we've had a really high employee attrition is the way you'd say it in the jargon, but high resignation rate. And the sort of big question came to me because a lot of those people were leaving with no job to go to. Now, that's like the biggest signal you're getting that something's wrong with people. Just generally don't take a pause in their working career. And so for everyone who resigns with no job to go to, there's been 10 Sunday nights sitting filled with dread, telling their mum, telling their partner, telling their cat that like things aren't right, they can't go on like this. And it's the 10th one where the cat says, for God's sake, just get on with it and do something about it. So, like they're in that situation. And we found ourselves in that zone. And I thought, have we done something? Have we engineered the way that we're working that is setting these people up for that burnout, that stress? And generally what you find is you chat to those people and they say, look, I'm working so hard. I'm so busy. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm not convinced I'm doing a good job. It actually goes to the heart of identity, really. They feel like they are failing. It goes like they feel like their identity is compromised. And so, yeah, it was just a really interesting one for me, like saying to myself, well, okay, well, what actions could we take? What interventions can we have as a system that would take these people away from this sort of stress, overwhelm, and sort of burnout, really? So, yeah, I was always obsessed with the dynamics of good working. And that's how I've ended up now, spending my full time doing that.
And you're really interested, obviously, as well in why teams thrive and why others actually don't. And talking a lot in your newsletter, which is fabulous, about whether or not we're actually seeing a decline in things like conscientiousness and agreeableness at work. And obviously, there's all those TikTok videos that you see about people doing horrendous things at work or to their employer. Do you think that people really are changing? Or do you think that work has just become so bureaucratic and uninspiring that it's kind of prompting these changes in behavior?
I think that's exactly the right question to ask. So there's two things going on. So in the data by a Financial Times data analyst called John Byrne Murdoch did some fabulous work during the pandemic that really got him into a lot of people's attention about the sort of the growth curves and the projections of where we were going to be with COVID. And he's done some analysis in the last month or so, looking at what are called the big five personality types, personality traits. So typically, this has been a much more reliable way to measure personality than things like Myers-Briggs, because if you measure someone and you ask them the questions, are you someone who completes everything you started? Are you someone who can be relied upon to get a job done? If you say you're going to do something, will you do it? The answers to those questions tend to be immovable over time, or they only move very, very slowly. We become a bit more conscientious over time, and we become a little less extroverted over time. But broadly, it's sort of gradual change. What John Byrne Murdoch has found in a panel, it's a US panel. I think it's about 17,000 young adults, 17,000 adults actually, variously from the age of 18 to 106. And what he's found is that actually extroversion has been strongly declining amongst all age groups, but especially amongst under 40s. Conscientiousness has been strongly declining amongst all age groups, but especially under 40s. And agreeableness has been slightly declining. And so he raised two questions. He said, well, is this something around the world that we're living in that is causing these declines? And if so, what is it? And his conclusion there is that it's likely to be the fact that we've got more distraction, the fact that there's more going on around us, maybe that we've got 100 reasons not to go out and leave our apartment. And so that raises one interesting question. My favorite additional intervention on that, though, is there's a fabulous psychologist called Alex Haslam, who's a British psychologist who works in Brisbane. And
He's been on the podcast, actually.
Is he? Okay, I
Mhm.
adore that guy's work. Just
Mm.
the very, very best work. But he raised a question. He said, look, if we've created a version of work where people have been robbed of any autonomy, if they've been robbed of any control, they've been robbed of any ability to contribute to what they're doing, then is it a surprise that they say, I don't feel motivated to get my work done. I don't feel motivated to get it done. And helpfully, I think he went through the 7 questions that contribute to that conscientiousness and said, you can either decide that the world and the fabric of the world has changed, or that actually these are rational answers to a world of work now that is more bureaucratic, that is more regimented, that has no ability for us to bring our own sort of like improvisation and adaptation. And I think both can be true. So I think we have become a degree more introverted. There is some evidence that suggests Derek Thompson from The Atlantic in the US suggested that adults on average are spending about 100 minutes a day alone now, more than they did before the pandemic. So we are spending more alone time, electively sort of away from other people. So that definitely is going on. And I think in addition, our work has just become more boring. And I think if there's one thing
Yes,
that but that's a really critical thing. If you ask
it
video
is.
game designers and you say to them, how do you create a great game design? They say, eliminate boring. Make sure if you're playing video games, if you're doing the same level over and over again and it's not evolved, then even though it might be a tricky challenge, people will tap out, they'll leave. You've got to eliminate boredom. And the notion that just because we're being paid a wage, we leave our boredom threshold at the door, I think is a big mistake that organizations can make. We need to think about, well, if we're asking people to sit on 20 hours a week of Teams calls, then is it any surprise that they're bored, that they're not paying attention, that they're not doing their best work? And I think, that's the sort of the critical thing that we need to think about in terms of job design going forward.
Yeah, I was going to say job design. I mean, we've known about this for decades. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, that we keep failing, I think, to continue to enrich jobs with the technology, with the entertainment, with the distraction that we have now. So if you're a leader listening to this, I think you're probably going to be thinking, what do I do about culture if people maybe are less extroverted, if they want to spend time not here and at home by themselves? How do I go about building culture? Because that's shifted, hasn't it, from how we might have used to do it. The pizza nights don't cut it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We quite often think that the perks, benefits, communication can change culture, and it's far more systemic than that. It's far more about the systems that exist inside an organization. So, look, the first thing you might say is that here's what I did when I had burnout in my organization, is that we did an audit of the amount of meetings that people had every week. On average, people were in meetings for about 25 hours a week in that organization. And we just said, well, can we halve that? Can we get that down to half? And still 12 and a half hours a week of meetings
It's a
is a
lot.
large number. Yeah.
Yes.
But, can we halve it? And we probably got it down by about a third. So it's still a big number, but it had a disproportionate impact on
Mm-hmm.
the lived experience of those people, because they now felt like they were less overwhelmed than they were before. Look, and it was a
Mm,
work in progress. There's no doubt I could have done more. But you immediately notice then that people feel a bit more able to get their work done. You know, sometimes
mm-hmm.
we describe this as work intensity.
Mm,
If you've got someone, your Amazon delivery driver would be one example of this. If you've got someone who has no scope to pause and have a conversation with people they're passing by,
mm,
they've got no opportunity to interact with other people because they've got such a pressing target, such a demanding scheduler on them, then their enjoyment of the job completely disappears. And if we can reduce work intensity, maybe by reducing the amount of time we spend in meetings for us, it actually has a disproportionate uplift in our enjoyment of that job. So
mhm,
just thinking about those things, so culture is far more contributed to by systems and processes than it is by emails and pizza. So just
mm,
thinking about what can you do to redesign, recalibrate the job. Does that meeting need to be an hour? Could it be
mhm.
15 minutes? You know, does
Does
it
it need
need
to
to
be
be
a
a
meeting at
meeting?
all? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Mm,
right.
mm. And I think the emphasis on that, as you said, on the culture, I think is really important because I was reading today about Pinterest. I don't know if you've seen this. They've opened a new office in Sydney, and it's a bit like the old days of Google, I think, with the slides. So they've got a karaoke bar, they've got free matcha, they've got free food. It's the whole thing has been designed to look like a house, a kind of wellness hub. And that's great, except if everyone's just going to sit in meetings all day, if the intensity is too high, if you've got a psychopathic boss, I think sometimes there's a big disconnect, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And look, you know, the phrase I hear a lot from HR leaders right now is moments that matter. And so
Mm,
what they're leaning into there is leaning into, oh, if we create more social interactions, then
mm-hmm,
it will help the well-being of the team. I think to some extent, most of us now, if we are making a journey into the office, then having some meaningful impact in our jobs is more valuable than a social interaction first.
yeah.
So social can definitely come. Social is definitely a indicator of a healthy team, but just leaning into the social is probably underestimating the role that work actually has in people's lives. People
Mm,
derive a lot of personal meaning from their jobs. If
mm,
they feel like they've done something well, their own identity is enhanced. And if they feel like they're just getting the train into town to do
mm.
some karaoke, it feels a touch trivial. Oh, how lovely. I spent $30 getting into the office, but I had some kombucha. It's not the best trade-off that we've ever been offered.
No. Do you think, on that note, we're training ourselves out of teams? And from that research you were highlighting earlier, that after the pandemic, we're just a bit sick of it, that there's so much interruption in the office, we often can't concentrate to get things done. So, are we training ourselves out of being part of groups? And do we still need teams in the same way that we've always had them at work?
Yeah, these are the most fundamental questions I think that are presented to all of us, and I think we need to take a step back and say, well, look, firstly, the evidence is really strongly that the collective intelligence of the team is higher than the individual intelligence of individuals, and the broadened perspective you get from multiple vantage points from a well calibrated team is massively at an advantage at one
Mm,
single person making a decision. So those things are really unequivocally true. Teams are better than individuals. We know it repeatedly in all the data. The question then we might ask is, well, have we proved that benefit to individuals? And
mm,
these, aside from the data that I mentioned before, that people are becoming less extroverted, less conscientious, less agreeable, they're spending less time around other people, we might even ask, have we advocated the case for teams to young people in the way that we might have done in the past? I'll give you sort of a broad piece of basic psychology, really, that In the past, probably the first thing we could say is that our first group, our first team that we were part of was our family. And the way that we'd see that manifested is that we'd sit down and have meals with our family. We'd sit down and, you know, 15 years ago, we'd sit down and watch TV with our family. And there was a lot of collective family experiences that you'd sit down and watch a show and you'd talk about it. And actually, the appraisal of hearing what your mum said or your dad said or what your brother said about it was a big part of you either learning to disagree agreeably or
Mm-hmm.
to learn how people were articulating things that they were interpreting. It's a really important part of sort of collective experience. But now most young people watch TV on their phones, on their own, in their bedroom. Um, the world's leading expert on teenage mental well-being, and I don't always agree with everything she says, but she says that teenagers have gone from generation we to generation me. You know, they used to watch TV shows around their friends, and you know that was a collective interpretation. They were listening to music around their friends, and now they broadly do those things, maybe enhanced by phone screens, but they do those things alone. Now, that I think was the basis of that connection was an important introductory level to the power of teams, about working with other people, about compromises where everyone gets what they didn't ask for, and you know, like just that adaptation. And I don't think we've always made the case right now for young people to be in teams. So you often hear that young people, you know, they'd rather just get work done on their own. They can get it done. They can get their music on. Now, you know, that's not victim blaming on young people, but I think what we know is if we can demonstrate the benefit of being in a really good team, it can be life enhancing for all of us. You know, most of the time, if you ask people to describe their favorite ever job, they'll describe a team they were in that was just incredible and hilarious and life affirming and energizing. That's what they'll describe. They won't describe the job they did that they won 3 awards and they worked on their own. They'll often describe a collective experience. And I think that's probably an important lesson for us, that we need to make the case for teams. Teams are definitely more effective than individuals, but probably we have to presume less knowledge now about the power teams than there maybe was 10 or 15 years ago.
Mm. Bruce, I want to talk about that in the context of the hybrid remote work revolution that we've had. And you've also talked about this in terms of like a remote living revolution. So do you think that is reshaping what we expect from work, and again along this kind of chosen solitude theme?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things going on with the flexible working. Broadly, I'm very strongly in favor of it. I'm very strongly in favor of people having some degree of flexibility. The most uh, what I've broadly observed in the organizations I've worked with is the bigger your organization, the more office time you sort of need to mitigate that. Microsoft have been quite revealing, actually. Some of the data I've been looking at this week, Microsoft have just announced a shift from 2.5 days in the office to 3 days in the office. And they say that was entirely formed by them analyzing engagement data. Really, they call it thriving data, but they say,
Mm-hmm.
you know, whether people feel energized, connected and inspired to do great work, is they describe that as thriving. And they said that people who never came to the office were showing lower levels of connection and thriving. So they say they've been entirely data led by it. But what we are seeing is that smaller organizations, you know, if you work in a 5-person organization, 1 day a week in the office together can often do the job, because you'll go in, you won't necessarily have loads of meetings, you'll end up chatting to each other, you maybe have lunch together, and that can be the re-energization that you need. So broadly, the bigger the organization, the more office time they tend to need to feel fully connected into the sort of the matrix. But flexible working has been transformational, especially for people with care responsibilities, especially for women. Um, you know, 1 in 10 people have got care responsibilities. So it's not just children; it's parents, it's, you know, neighbors, it's partners, and so there is the ability to get your life into a greater equilibrium has been a really important mitigation step for a lot of people. So, you know, so just getting a bit of balance and on that has been, I think, a really important step. You know, for example, one of the things we witness is that A lot of young people are living further away from the office than they did 10,
Hmm.
15 years ago. And so, sometimes it's described as the housing theory of everything. But if you can't afford to live
Right.
a sort of 15-minute journey from the office, then
Mm.
you don't want to be coming in every day, because suddenly you've got this burden on you to
Hmm.
lose all this unproductive time coming in. And
Mm.
when we look at the evidence of that, people working from home, they typically save between 30 minutes and an hour every day. And for most of us in a busy, hectic life, that's the
Mhm.
difference between being right at the threshold of stress and actually having just a little bit of breathing room where we can enjoy our lives. So
Yeah.
I think it is complicated. I remember reading something um, by Shonda Rhimes, who's like the Charles Dickens of American TV. She's sort of produced all manner of things, from Bridgerton to How to Get Away with Murder to Scandal. And she did a commencement speech where she said, "Every time you see me succeeding at something, what you don't realize is I'm failing at something else. So you
Mm.
see me stepping up and collecting an Emmy award. What you don't realize is my daughter was feeling anxious about school and I wasn't able to put her to bed that night. Or you see me at the last taping of Sandra Oh on Grey's Anatomy, and that day my mom had a doctor's appointment and I wasn't able to accompany her." And what I loved about that is she was articulating the duality that a lot of us have, that yes, we have work identities, but we also have real life identities. And quite often they live in conflict with each other. And as a result, to reduce that conflict and just to feel like we're not being bad at one thing because we're being good at the other, it's just an important way for us to just feel better about ourselves, back to identity again.
Mm.
It's just an important way for us to feel like we're doing things well, rather than, I sacrifice my personal life so my boss would be happy.
I think it's very important, as you said, in relation to belonging and culture. And I want to come back to culture a little bit, because you've talked a fair bit about Octopus Energy as a company that has been able to scale authentically and retain culture, because we know that's an enormous challenge in organizations. So, what did they do differently that do you think others are missing?
Yeah, if I was going to boil octopus down to one thing, it's really an interesting culture because it's close to 10,000 people, so it's not a small organization. It's the biggest supplier of power, gas, and electricity in the UK. So it's grown gradually, but it's become a success based on better service. And if I was going to articulate it in one way, it's they've gifted autonomy to their workers.
Mm.
So most of us are in an organization where we don't feel able to make decisions about things. We're not able to get things done. We need to go and ask a manager's approval. And we've witnessed this. So much of culture, I think, can be observed in retail stores and restaurants. Our first instinct when we're thinking about culture is we look at sports teams. Sports teams aren't always a perfect example. They're quite different to the way that we work. But restaurants and supermarkets are a really good place to observe culture in action. If something goes wrong in a restaurant, if the waiter says, "Don't worry, I've got this. I'll sort that out for you. I'll take that off your bill." It's so energizing because you feel like an injustice has been dealt with instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And compare it to when something goes wrong, maybe on a vacation or a flight, and no one feels able to make that decision, and they say, "I don't know, I'll go and ask," and they go away, or you have to write, you have to fill in a form, and you witness it's just a very different setup. Now, anything that can feel closer to that restaurant server saying, "I'm going to take that off the menu," is where you end up with workers feeling empowered, inspired, motivated by their job, because they feel like most of us feel able to make decisions to recognize what a customer wants. If you ask us, do you know how to improve your job? Most of us have got an opinion of how to improve our job, um, but we often realize that, oh, if I was going to make my job better, I'd change this computer system. We go and tell our boss says that's the system, so get on with it,
Mm-hmm.
and we feel disempowered. What Octopus did is that they learn very quickly from feedback loops from their team. They learn very quickly from feedback loops from their customers. And in addition, they are very focused on giving employees autonomy. So employees are able to scrub someone's bill down for a month. They're able to give someone a discount. They're able to make a decision about something that went wrong. It does two things. It reduces like this red tape, this sort of burden of responsibilities going up the chain, and it also allows the company to work faster and be more energized. So I went and I chatted to the chief exec of Octopus Energy, but interestingly, the moment after I completed a conversation with him, someone came up to me and said, my son works at Octopus Energy, and every single thing he's just said there, my son would agree with. He said,
Wow.
my son wishes he'd joined there 5 years ago. It's, you know,
Wow.
the best place. So lead through autonomy is probably the most important lesson of Octopus.
You don't often hear that. I think it's so important. So let's talk about AI in the mix of all of this then, which is very interesting. So on the one hand, we saw at King that the AI replaced the teams who built them. But then at Klarna, we had the CEO first coming out and bragging, saying, you know, oh, we've replaced our staff with AI, and then kind of walked back from that and said, oh, actually, surprise, our customers wanted humans. So what are you seeing, and what do you think is going to sort of emerge from all of this chaos?
Yeah, two interesting different examples. The King one, I think King, owned by Microsoft, were probably keen to sort of to brush that one aside and not have too much attention on it. But effectively, the team had built, the Candy Crush team had built some AI apps that could build new levels of Candy Crush. And once they'd created those AI tools and bedded them in, the team themselves who'd trained the AI were fired. So it's quite a dystopian perspective. That is, it's a vision of AI that most definitely is not the harmonious world that we want. The Klarna one was a really good example of the opposite. Salesforce have done something similar. Salesforce have been out in the last couple of months saying that half of their work now is done by AI. Klarna said something similar. They said, oh, our AI customer service bots are so good that we're getting rid of staff. I think the Klarna one was trying to hype the stock price. They were trying to position themselves as an AI stock because those stocks have got higher valuations.
Mm,
And so, like
mm.
you say, they came out afterwards and said, oh, we're now hiring again. We want more people because it just hadn't gone the way that they'd intended. And interestingly, the power of great journalism, journalists had been tracking the job adverts they had out there. And
Mm.
journalists were saying, by the way, for a company that claims that they don't need employees anymore, they're hiring a lot of employees. So it was a great example of journalism holding leaders to account. Yeah, it's going to
Accountable.
be an interesting one, really. You know, a lot of this
Mm.
stuff that we're seeing comes from the AI firms. So Anthropic have been out saying that half of all jobs will be automated by AI.
Mm.
And you might conclude, yeah, they would say that, wouldn't they? And I think we're in a really difficult moment right now in trying to pick between what the truth is, what the hype is, and where we're going to end up. There's definitely extreme predictions that are, I think, you know, deserve attention,
Mhm.
suggesting that a lot of work is going to be automated or definitely enhanced by AI. It's just going to be an interesting few years working out how that will happen. It does appear to be going slightly slower right now than some of the projections have suggested.
Mm. And I think I'm not surprised by that, because if we look at flexible work and working from home and all the things that we take for granted now, we had the ability to do that for decades before the pandemic. And we had the technology, but the barrier was us, was humans, was our mindset, was the willingness to think differently and look at things differently. So, on the one hand, I think that slower progression is perhaps not surprising at all. But on that, in terms of, I'm just fascinated with the aloneness and this chosen solitude piece, because I think, as you said, people feel very overwhelmed, whether it's their work intensity, what's going on in the world, all kinds of different things. Can we survive this drift if you think, well, people want to work for themselves? We saw, I think Jen Z don't want to be managers because they've decided that looks too difficult and too stressful, or I'd just rather work for myself or be a YouTuber. Can we survive this? Do you think there's going to be a return to wanting to be together?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Look, the reason why, in the first instance, I don't ever think it's unhealthy that work plays a smaller part in our life than it does at
Mm,
the moment.
mm,
For a lot of people, work is their identity. They work while they're paid for 40 hours of work a week. Evidence suggests that if you have email on your phone, you're working somewhere closer to 70 hours. So,
right.
it's no surprise then that work becomes our identity because it's the main thing that we do. And we live or die by success at work. If you're in the first part of your career, if you work hard, you might get thrown a slightly higher pay rise. And so you think the way I'm going to get my foot on the property ladder is if I just do
Mm-hmm.
a bit more of that. And so, the returns to that are better. Getting to a place where work isn't our identity, and actually the big thing about us is that we're in a band on a Tuesday nights, or that we're an active leader of the running club, or we're just doing other things, I think is a really healthy place to be. So changing that relationship, I think, is a really important thing. The challenge we have is if we replace the cohesion and collective experience of being around other people at work with isolation.
Mm,
If
mm,
we're only in the office 2 days a week, but those other days we don't see anyone. And
mm,
you only need to chat to people about the horrors of dating app world to suggest that, like the some of the things that might have been easy and routine in previous generations aren't as easy anymore. Technology hasn't necessarily enhanced our life experience. And so look,
mm,
if we can build stronger collective experiences outside of work, I think that's the
mm,
best outcome.
mm,
In the absence of that, then work does have a role to play in fulfilling us more. The one thing that is almost like the big, the learning that we've known for the last 30 years already about psychology, but every single year is growing, is the fact that people give us strength. Being around other people and having company and having friends is the single most important thing for our well-being. And the opposite of that, loneliness, is the single worst thing for our well-being. Now,
mm,
work did provide some of that. It did provide a sense of connection, cohesion, community. It did provide some congregation. The thing that we probably the single thing that it's worth reminding ourselves about work is that the biggest predictor of whether we like our job is whether we've got a friend at work,
mm,
and our best friend actually in the data. And it's just a really important reminder that work is about connection. The thing that I've been most impacted by in the last 12 months is I chatted to a psychologist called Zach Mercurio. And Zach didn't teach me anything new, but he gave me a word for something that I'd been scrambling around to understand. So that idea that having a friend at work would really be important for us was also adjacent in my thinking to something else that we know about work, that one of the second biggest predictors of whether we're engaged with work is whether our boss has given us feedback this week. And Zach gave me the word for those things. He said, this is what psychologists call mattering. The idea that we feel significant to others is one of the most important foundational elements of our sense of well-being, our sense of identity, our sense of feeling meaningful as an adult, and that sense of mattering. So, one thing I always reach for is there's a bit of poetry by a poet called David White, British Irish poet called David White, and he wrote this sort of, it's like an essay really, like it's rather than a poem, but it's just full of lyrical phrases. And he said, he said, friendship is the gift of being seen by someone, and the equal gift of knowing that we've been seen by another. And like this is, it's worth checking out his poem on friendship. But for
mm,
me, that's all about mattering. That sense that we've been seen by someone, we've been understood, we've been accepted for who we are. That's what mattering for me is all about. And so, you know, you'll think back. your favorite ever boss might have been someone who spoke really directly to you, gave you blunt feedback, didn't pull any punches. But what was significant was that you felt like you mattered. You felt like your
Mm.
work mattered to them. And, quite often they're the people who we will, fight to work for. We will feel like that we did our best ever work because we feel like we mattered to them. And I think if we can sustain a sense of mattering in our jobs, but also sustain a sense of mattering outside of our jobs, all of those things are in service of us living a happier life.
Mm. Want to go a little bit into the future now with two questions before we finish up. Bruce, the first one, I think every day we would see on our phones anywhere, ridiculous headlines in the media about anything from, maybe we have a matcha bar or karaoke in our office to whatever it is. And I think you've talked about this in terms of workplace trend nonsense. So what do you think is nonsense? And what do you think we should really pay attention to over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few of these things that the phenomenon of quiet quitting is probably the one that got the most attention. And
Yep.
look, the truth about quiet quitting is it's just a new word for an existing thing.
Yes.
Quiet quitting, the way that Gallup describe engagement is they say that I think the Australian figures are about the same as the British figures, that about
Mm.
10, 11, 12% of people are actively
Mhm.
engaged in their job. About
Mhm.
15% about 15% of people are actively disengaged. That means they're trying to bring down the organization.
Mhm.
They're they're in guerrilla warfare against their firm. And then the vast majority of the rest of us, about 75% of people, they now describe it as quiet quitting, but they're just passively disengaged. They're just not working that hard. You see
Mhm.
them, the receptionists in buildings, or people in jobs that they just aren't really doing their best work. And I'm of the view that most people, if you give them a reason to work harder, if you motivate them, they'll do a better job and they'll be more inspired by it. So
Mm.
quiet quitting feels like it's sort of a voguish term. I think it's just another word for what has always existed.
Mm.
Um, some of the trends, quite often you see people reaching for just new trends all the time, and I've seen one journalist say, effectively, you're just giving a word for something that already exists.
Mm.
It's not necessarily helpful. The trends I think that we need to keep an eye on are burnout levels,
Mhm.
the disengagement levels, loneliness, workplace loneliness is definitely growing. If we can serve to overcome those things, then I am very strongly of the opinion that work is a force for good in our lives. That, if you have a look at the evidence, people with jobs are happier than people without jobs. People in jobs have better mental health than people without jobs. Work gives us a sense of accomplishment, even if we recognize at times our job isn't brain surgery, it isn't making the world a better place. It just gives us a sense of satisfaction to have a job that's well done and completed.
Mm. Yes, I totally agree. And finally, Bruce, if we could start from the beginning, throw out all of the ways of working that we've got and start from the ground up, designing culture from scratch, what would you do?
Yeah, the from a subjective opinion, from my point of view, a
Mm.
good day at work for me is a day I laugh a lot. So,
Mm.
you're like, I would go home, and when I've worked in big companies, when I've worked now, I'm in a far smaller setup. But a good day for me is when I've laughed. If I've laughed 10 times, it's a
Great.
fantastic day at work. And sometimes I used to have a boss who once said, "Not known to be seen laughing, like you don't want to be caught laughing right now."
Oh,
And
wow.
I really took that on board. I was like, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. Laughing is the opposite of working. And
Mm.
it's not the case at all. We only laugh with
Mm.
people we like. We only laugh with
Mhm.
people we trust.
Mhm.
Laughing is a really strong signal of connection. So we tend to laugh when we sort of we're trying to signal togetherness. It's like it's just a social signal, and so laughing is a really good sign that we are. We tend to laugh about stressful things. Like it's a coping mechanism. So laughing for me is a really big signal that we're able to keep balance, proportion, equilibrium to our jobs. So look, a job that has got scope for that isn't too intensive, that is honest about what needs to be done and what isn't. Do you need 30 hours a week of Zoom calls? I did one intervention with one team, and they asked me to come in and do a burnout workshop. And so I started off by asking for a show of hands of who spent more than 10 hours, 15 hours, 20 hours a week in meetings. And someone said, I'm going to stop you. We all spend 40 hours a week in meetings. I said, well, great. Well, we've got a burnout issue. We're all doing 40 hours a week. Now, the big challenge is, could we work out a way to do less? And she said, I'm going to stop you there. We're not going to do any less than 40 hours a week. So, okay, well, I'm not sure what
I can
role
help.
I can fulfill here, because I think I've diagnosed while you're all burnt out. And if the patient's not willing to change, then we're not going to, there's not a magic answer where you can suddenly do 40 hours a week of, if I said
Meetings.
to you, that's right. If I'm going to ask you to do 40 hours a week of press ups, you're going to be tired. I'm not going to make you less tired because I've done a little workshop that kids you, that tries to trick you. And that's it. So just being honest about the inputs and the outputs of work, and recognizing that having a laugh at work is probably an important part of getting that social benefit, that social cure that connection really has.
Couldn't agree more. I think we all need a lot more laughter at work, a lot less burnout. Bruce, where can people find out more about what you're doing now, about your podcast, and about your work?
Yeah, almost everything you mentioned it along the way. Almost everything I do is free and is on my newsletter. And my newsletter is called Make Work Better. If you search that, you can find it pretty quickly. But everything's free, and probably about 45 weeks of the year, I publish just the latest digest on what's happening, what the latest discussion on work is, what the data is. So each week, pretty much, I just shine a spotlight on brilliant work done by other people, or conversations that I've had with important figures, really.
Yeah, it's a great newsletter. We will link that in the show notes. Highly, highly recommend reading it. Bruce, it's been fantastic to chat with you again. And thank you so much for your time coming on the floor plan today.
Thanks. Great to chat to you again.